Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar today. It's my pleasure on behalf of the leadership of CSPC to host Dr. Oscar Jonsson, joining us from the Swedish Defense University today for a discussion about his new book, The Russian Understanding of War. My colleague Joshua Huminski will be hosting a discussion and Q&A shortly, but let me first quickly introduce Dr. Jonsson. He's the Director for Phronesis Analysis and a researcher at the Swedish Defense University and holds a PhD from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. He earlier was Director of the Center for the Governance of Change and the Stockholm Free World Forum, and has also been a visiting researcher at UC Berkeley and a subject matter expert for the headquarters of the Swedish Armed Forces. So with that and his new book out from the Georgetown University Press, I can think of someone in a great situation and experience to tell us about what we understand about the Russian military. So Joshua and Dr. Jonsson, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dan. I'm very excited to be hosting and speaking with you, Dr. Jonsson. Your book is absolutely fantastic. I'm going to try to hold it up to the camera and see if I can't get it to zoom in properly. Highly recommend everybody pick this book up. It was written, there we go, perfect copy of it there. It was written before Russia's expanded invasion in 2022, and it was incredibly insightful to the evolution of not just Russian, but Soviet, but then post-Soviet understanding of the framework of war and peace. I want to give you the floor to start with kind of what was your thinking behind the book, what inspired it, and kind of the theoretical framework that draws us to today. And then we can certainly talk about Ukraine, but I think it's very important to understand those intellectual antecedents and framework that you cover so fantastically. But I also have to say one quick thing. King's College London is a fantastic program. I did the MA in war studies there, so it's great to be talking to a King's alum. So over to you to start with this, Dr. Jonsson.
Thank you very much, Joshua, and thank you everyone for joining. And indeed, King's is a great place. I felt so much at home after my MA that I applied for the PhD directly and just stayed on. I will very briefly just outline a little bit on the thinking behind the book, what to expect for it, and the rest will just be a free-flowing discussion. But what I've done is I have been going through around 140 Russian military theorists and political elite statements on what they believe that war is. And just like in the West, the Russian understanding of war have traditionally always been focusing on the use of armed violence. That has been the basis from Clausewitz's conception of what war is up until today. However, in 2012, when I started reading Russian military theory, I started seeing these things that, the boundaries between war and peace are blurring and that non-military means are becoming more effective than military. And mind you, this is in 2012. This was before Russian invasion of Ukraine the last time around, because it was only after then those kind of discussions exploded in the West, where we said, oh, wait, maybe there is this blurring of lines between war and peace. And I wanted to get to the bottom, not only that the boundaries between war and peace were blurring, but why they were blurring. And the long story short, which I do, I provide the anatomy from the Soviet Union when Lenin read Clausewitz and worked that into Marxist-Leninism doctrine on what war is, up until what I argued the big shift in 2012, 2014, comes with the heightened threat of popular uprisings within the frame of color revolutions and the use of information warfare. And in essence, it's the Russian political leadership that believe that the West have become so effective in essentially brainwashing local populations to overthrow their governments through information influence, through ideological influence, through the use of intelligence agencies, so that Russia's biggest geopolitical setbacks, if we disregard the current war, has been in Georgia, in Ukraine, and attempted in Belarus and attempted in Russia, has come from the phenomena of color revolution. Basically, people overthrowing kleptocrats and then becoming more pro-Western after that. So the whole argument made in the book is that from 2012, 2014, the expansion of what war is in Russia the war has expanded to become so much more about non-military means than just military ones. I'll start. I'll stop there, and then we'll go on for the discussion.
What I thought was particularly fascinating about your book is the extent to which that you highlight that evolution of the changing, not just the character of war, which is very much what the West focuses on, but the very nature of war. And I'm curious if you could tease that out about how Russia had understood that evolution, from the Soviet times to the post-Soviet times, and where that set up the framework for the conflict in 2014, which I think took many in the West by surprise. And we talked about the little green men, and we talked about the subversion, the hybrid warfare, the Gerasimov doctrine, which suddenly seemed to emerge on the stage. But you argue in the book that this is a natural sort of evolution of this thought process, and it's a function that the West just wasn't paying attention.
Yeah, indeed. I think that there's a number of whys to why this happened. I think the most part of the book, what I try to do is to convince the reader that it has happened, that the most senior military officials have swung and started saying that, Chief of General Staff Gerasimov saying that non-military means are 4 times as important as military ones. So I think that one part is the Soviet legacy. The Marxist-Leninist worldview saw as a kind of inevitable conflict with the imperialist world, because the imperialist by its nature was aggressive. So even when, for instance, the Soviet Union launched the war against Finland, the Finnish Winter War, it was a defensive action because it was preemptive towards the aggressive imperialistic nature of all the other states. But what I do show in the book is that up until 2012, Russian military theorists were all agreeing, just like the way we see it in the West, that war is the use of armed violence. If you don't have armed violence, it's something else. It's statecraft, it's diplomacy, it's political war, what have you not. But war proper was something else. However, this came to change for a number of reasons, and I think one of them, which is probably one of the more underreported aspects of the Russian political system, is that the Russian political system is run essentially by security and intelligence services. So you look at the Russian Security Council, they are the ones who are shaping the national security strategy, which all strategies in Russia needs to agree with. That includes the economic strategy, but that also includes the military doctrine. So when you read the military doctrine or the national security strategy, you'll find a couple of sentences saying the risks of military conflicts have increased, military instrument is a tool of geopolitical power. But then the bulk of the focus of the national security strategy is the classic intelligence and security threats, talking about the erosion of psycho-sociological values, of moral patriotic traditions in Russia, which is leading to civil unrest. So I think one part of the reason why you're seeing this threat complex as the most important one is that because Russia is run by intelligence and security people. So I think that trickled down to the military leadership when they look at the political masters and see, okay, what is occupying their minds? We need to cater to their problem set. And I think that has to do with, if you're a mediocre intelligence analyst in Russia, you will quite quickly find out that NATO is not in a position to invade Russia. It doesn't have the force posture. It doesn't have, the intention. It doesn't have the troops. Like, it's not a military threat. But every day on the Red Square, you have the political opposition challenging the legitimacy of the regime. And that is tying into the doctrinal statements in the Russian national security strategy, saying that the psychological sabotage from the West and the US in particular, but from the West, are eroding Russian values and fomenting civil society unrest. So I think a key part of how the Russian understanding of war shifted has to do with the elites and the intelligence and security elites' way of viewing the world. So what happened in 2014, when you saw the explosion of concepts to come to terms with Russian warfare in Ukraine in 2014, was partly due to, we haven't really looked, it was partly due to that Russian annexation of Crimea and fomenting an unrest in eastern Ukraine was mainly successful due to the use of non-military means. And that was, not only, unmarked troops, which were military means, but what was fundamental but less visible to the open eye was they have been building human networks of pro-Russian voices through their intelligence services, through organized crime. So when the Russian leadership called up and said, hey, we need mass protest, they could arrange that because they had those non-military means in place. And a lot of what went wrong in the 2022 invasion was because they assumed they would go the same way as 2014, that local power brokers were corruptible, they were threatenable, they were that they had people on the inside that could break down resistance. Actually, as put by a recent RUSI report, Russia's whole strategy to the 2022 invasion was premised on a strategy of non-military means to deliver a disorganization of Ukrainian political leadership, command and control, and troops. So even though we're back into doing things that most military analysts haven't been doing for a while, calculating artillery production, we cannot miss that Russia's whole strategy was premised on a coup d'etat in Ukraine, breaking down Ukrainian command and control and political leadership through non-military means, the way it was successful in doing in 2012. Okay, I'm getting a bit long-winded. I will specifically address the Gerasimov doctrine and the hybrid warfare. In a kind of attempts to understand what happened, all these new concepts were launched, and so much has been said about them. But I think one of the most important parts to understand why they were so popular was that you cannot say, as a policy practitioner in the West, you cannot say, look, Russia had a successful political war combined with light military force that was successful. We should have known, we should have seen it. Rather, you have to say, the Russians revolutionized warfare and caught us in this precarious place between war and peace where we were completely unable to act. And therefore, they were so successful that we need to up investments in security and defense. We cannot say this has been the stuff of which military invasions has always been done through decades. Let's get more money to handle it. So I think actually the policy utility perspective in the West was one of the reasons why saying Russia's revolutionized warfare has become so popular. Because if you look back through history, there's nothing more consistent than Russia's invasion starting with intelligence and security services trying to do a coup d'etat. It was the same in the Finnish Winter War, it's the same in the Czech Republic, it was the same in the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan, which also has the similarity of the vast majority of the troops had no idea about the game plan, but the KGB was going to assassinate the leader and instill a new regime, and then everything will be fine. Exactly the same way you did now. So I think a lot of the novelty was rather saying we haven't been paying attention. So.
No, it's incredibly instructive and enlightening about that, because it's, as you talked about in your book and you just mentioned now, that the fact that we weren't necessarily paying attention to it created almost a novelty in it itself. And it leads into another point that I wanted to tease out, because you write very, very well in your conclusion, and I want to quote this specifically. You basically say that there's a underlying fallacy in the West's understanding. Western states believe it is up to them to choose whether they enter a war with Russia or not. Rather, as the Russian leadership sees itself in an information war, being targets with color revolution and subversion, is equivalent to the use of force. And it's a very interesting framework, because certainly in Washington's perspective, it's a very binary choice. It is either war or it is peace. And as you write, that's not necessarily the case. And in many ways, Russia already thought and saw itself at war, the West at war with it. I'm curious if you could talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think my argument is that there's a systemic conflict between Russia and the West. And I think it becomes obvious if you consider kind of the pillars, I mean, in particular, the EU pillars, is based on democracy, free markets, and the rule of law. And if you look at the Russian regime's grip on power, it is premised on the infringement of the rule of people, of democracy. It is dependent on an elite-controlled economy, and it's conditioned upon the rule by law, the use of law as an instrument for power. So at its existence, it's all of these ideas that is on the basis of what it means to be the West, that has made Ukraine twice have successful popular revolutions saying, we don't want the Russian way, we want this way. And because the conflict is so fundamental, it's not about, did the West offer, Ukraine a NATO partnership for peace agreement or not. It's the whole construction that is a threat to the Russian regime's grip on power. And that's also one of I think this realization also coincides in time with the shift in the Russian understanding of war in 2012, 2014. The most significant protest in Russia was at the Duma and presidential elections 2011, 2012, when Putin came back to power. That was kind of when the veil of democracy fell for real, when Medvedev said, we agreed that Putin would rerun. And it was also those protests that Vladimir Putin directly blamed Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and saying she started them, she gave the sign. And I think at that time, the Russian leadership understood that they need to undermine the whole idea of a liberal democracy, not just being defensive of saying, we have our own version of democracy, but rather saying, no, the West is decadence, it is suicides, it is pedophilia, it is LGBTQ tyranny, we need to undermine this idea that grabs the hold of the states and our borders. I mean, Belarus 2005, 2020. And this is not a theoretical problem for the Russian leadership, because the Russian opposition have been to Maidan in Kiev and said, we're going to bring this movement back to Moscow. So I think that makes the whole conflict quite fundamental, because what would happen in Ukraine, and also moving to the current war, what would happen if Ukraine had a successful regime change in 2014? You overthrow the kleptocratic Yanukovych, and then you start an integration process with the West, where Ukraine becomes more stable, more democratic, and more prosperous for every year that goes. What example does that show to Russia, so-called brother nation, previously?
Following on from that, one of the points that you raise as well is that the actions of Western states that are supposed to be a way of avoiding war, a substitute for escalating to war, can often be seen as acts of war by Russian leadership. Looking at that, certainly, if our frame of reference for certainly the information revolution, the color revolutions, which certainly from the Western perspective were wholly organic democratic movements, but were not seen that way, obviously by Moscow, as you just referenced, how did the actions of the West sort of feed into that narrative that Russia saw? So we obviously, Hillary Clinton, Michael McCaul as the ambassador to Moscow at the time, their involvement in that. What other things did you see or do see as feeding into that paranoia that Moscow certainly held? Yeah, no, I think one of the best examples is in 2014, the response to the Russian invasion was very lackluster. But what we did was impose a lot of economic sanctions, most of them coming after 6 months when the Russian side accidentally downed a passenger airplane. Up until then, you only had some symbolic sanctions on symbolic figures in the Russian regime, none of the real power brokers, none of the real oligarchs. Anyway, the West response was mainly based on sanctions. And that was for us kind of a middle way of doing something significant or not doing anything. Like, we need to show that this is wrong and there's a cost, and some sanctions are what we're going to do. And that was in 2014 an explicit alternative to doing something more forceful. But the way in which several policymakers said in Europe and in the US as well was saying that now we don't think that these sanctions will, magically change Russian policy, but it can make the oligarchs so unhappy that they change Putin, throwing up. And whichever way you cut it, it's us saying our economic sanctions will have a regime change impact in Russia.
And that's, Sergei Lavrov said it straight away, the West is seeking regime change through its sanctions. And that is no surprise when we have policymakers saying straight out that we are hoping that these sanctions will make it tough on the Russian elite so they will change the Russian leadership. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying that we're saying directly that we're hoping that these sanctions will lead to regime change. So for the Russian regime to see that as a kind of warfare, that is absolutely valid, I would say.
So bringing it forward to 2022, you referenced how the Russian invasion in February of last year was very much a carry-on of the model that was carried out in 2014, but also further afield. Within the timing of the conflict and the perspective from your understanding, how did Ukraine in 2022 fit within that understanding of war and peace? You said that they expected to kind of be a coup d'etat. It clearly did not happen the case. It was an underestimation of Ukrainian resolve and a predication of a plan that was copied and pasted and unsuccessful. How does that broadly fit within that framework that you're articulating? Or does it at all?
I think it does. And I think the first and the most fundamental part of how the 2022 invasion fits within the framework is that Ukraine was, from 2014, I would say, almost a fundamental / existential threat for Russia. I mean, that's why they invaded the first time. I think also that's the explanation for those of us old enough to remember. First, Russia seized Crimea, and then it took several weeks before they started the uprisings in Donetsk, Luhansk, but also in Kharkiv and Odessa. And my argument is that those uprisings in Ukraine proper, so to speak, was important because the 2014 invasion was never just about Crimea. They needed those uprisings to make sure that Ukraine fails. And the way in which they make sure that Ukraine fails is through using these as so-called frozen conflicts, but then the imposed solution, Minsk I and Minsk II agreement. Minsk II agreement would have led to a Russian veto in Ukrainian security and foreign policy affairs if implemented. And I think that what I'm getting at is the threat from a successful popular uprising in Ukraine, or Ukraine becoming more a part of the West. And I'm not saying it would have been an easy ride or an immediate ride or whatever. I'm just saying that the ideas of democracy, free market, and rule of law, the more they take ground, the more it sends an example into the Kremlin, looking at their own people looking at seeing it as successful. So that's why I think in the first place, Russia invaded 9 years ago. And I think that why they made a full-scale invasion 2022, it was a continuation. It was a continuation on, their goals towards Ukraine haven't changed all that much. They just saw that for every year that's passing, Ukraine is becoming further away from Russia. It's becoming stronger, more stable, and more West integrated. We used all our non-military means in principle, and what we have left is the full-scale military instrument. So I think it kind of fits the ladder of, in most cases, you want to use the non-military means to get what you want. And it's also important noting here that the Russian threat perception of non-military means comes from what we in the West discussed as soft power, which was something different. Joe Nye said you get a power from attraction because other countries want to be like you. And that is actually part of why Ukraine and Georgia and other states have had this uprisings, because they wanted to be a part of something different, what was seen as the most successful societal model that has been. So I think that the drivers behind why Russia chose the full-scale military invasion came from the perceived utility of Western non-military means. And then the way the invasion planned out, I think that I would be too Mr. Clever in retrospect to say, no, this was exactly how I think they would have done it. But looking at it 1 year on, and just reading on the historical precedents, as I said, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, KGB comes up with this fantastic plan. We're going to have this, we're going to have this coup, and then you send in the armed forces, and then they're mostly not prepared to do what's asked of them, and they have way too little troops to solve the larger combat mission. You can find these through the Russian military history. I mean, the Finnish Winter War is the other example I like to use. And while you can see it, I wouldn't have said so if you would have asked me in January 2022. But in retrospect, I can explain to you why there's a similarity. But no, I think that what happened in the 2022 full-scale invasion really needs to be understood by in particular the FSB coming up with a plan, telling the political leadership, we can deliver this, we can deliver significant disruption and disorganization in political leadership and command and control. And I mean, you have to ask yourself, why does Russia have National Guard, basically riot police, running in the front lines? Right. The Rusi report takes one example from Chernobyl, where the troops around Chernobyl calls the head of security at the plant and say, hey, what should we do? And the head of the security plant is a Russian asset. And he says, put down your weapons. We don't want any bloodshed. And that's really the vision they had for the whole of the country. But they couldn't deliver on it.
Looking at that framework, and you've seen obviously that the security and intelligence-led plan at the outset failed, as you articulated. Now we're finding ourselves in a very attritional conflict, a very grinding war. How have you seen sort of that transition play out, and where do you see the stresses within or between the sort of political military leadership within the Kremlin as a result of that failure?
Yeah, no, I think that you're it's a worn out cliche, but culture is strategy for breakfast. So and just to give you anecdotally, I worked at the Swedish Defense Staff and with the new military strategic doctrine, where you try to come up with all these clever ways in which the armed forces should behave better, which is an instrument to root out the old culture and get some new ways in there. But the problem is that even if you have the most clever new doctrine up at headquarters levels, how do you make sure that shifts the way things are being done out? I think that this is exactly the meeting, all of the novel thinking of this is the way future war is going to be fought. And much of it is really good theorizing. Much of it is better theorizing than we have in the West, I would argue. And this just the reason why Soviet military theorists, pioneers, both deep operations and the intellectual foundation to the revolution in military affairs, and also the perspectives of non-military warfare, of different types of unconventional warfare. The writing is really good, but the way in which that translates down through the whole organization, when you're still taught at the Russian General Staff Academy in a very mathematical way, you need to do an amphibious assault, then the book says you need 3 brigades, 1 squadron of fighter jets and mobile air defense. Like, there's always an answer to the exact situation you're in, and it's very mathematical. And I think that's just everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. When the Russian side got the first punch in the mouth, they went back to the way they've always done things. So that would be, decade plus of theorizing about hypermodern war in a single integrated information environment, et cetera, and then you're back to artillery, which has always been the backbone of the Russian military system.
It was very fascinating, and certainly last year and in 2020, to watch the videos, the very slickly produced Russian state propaganda video, the military looking very much like a Western military, operating very high speed, very advanced equipment, fast roping, clearing rooms, and it's like, wow, that looks very impressive. But then you look at what's happening today, and it's clear that that was very much a specific message that was being sent and not reflected by reality. as we find ourselves today. I'm curious with that, sort of, as you rightly said, the theory and practice is very well written. The execution is pretty appalling. And now we find ourselves in a situation where it's a very grinding, conscript, private military based artillery attritional fight. Where do you see this going forward at sort of the operational level? And I do want to turn back to the strategic political in a moment.
Sorry, I just realized I completely missed your other question on the political leadership versus the military leadership, because I want to address that one also. So I'm taking notes. Yeah, no, I think that Russia started this war with around 85% of its professional military soldiers and officers, and it was evident quite quickly that they needed men, but it took until September and they went through the mobilization. And now I think you're really getting to more and more of a two-tier armed forces, where you have the mass, which is mobilized soldiers and convicts, really doing just trench warfare or even human wave attacks, and then you have still some professional units, naval infantry, VDV, doing what is more professional soldier tasks, which is, I would say, which is a distinction that's functioned to some degree. Of course, you do mobilize soldiers with specialized competencies are going to specialized positions, but I do think it's really one big preoccupation is really just mass to the front, and the rest is building units that could actually do a bit more advanced military stuff. So I think that the war has taken most of the best soldiers in different ways, KIA, wounded, or desertions, or just quitting the contract. So I do think you need to really adapt the sophistication of what the entity can do on a mass scale accordingly. I think the auto mobilized soldiers got 3 months of training, which will be something very, very different than if you do 12 months conscription plus 2 years in the service. No, so I think that attrition is really the best hope for Russia right now. And I do think that, to loop back to the non-military domain, I do think that Russia's best bet winning this war is actually not the military war in Ukraine at the moment. It's the non-military war towards the West. Putin has said so much straight away that inflation, cost of living crisis, the economy going down, this will break the West resolve to support Kiev. And of course, they do what they can to heighten the problematic. By the blockade on Ukraine, by bombing critical industries, and also bombing critical infrastructure, just making it unlivable. It's the quickest way to ensure that there will be nothing left of the Ukrainian economy. So the offensive from the Russian side started in late January, which is kind of petering out right now, is so far not giving them any tangible results whatsoever. I think the best bet is really for attritioning the West and the West resolve to keep Ukraine alive militarily and economically, in hope of, I would say, especially January 2025 and the potential new presidency in the US would be one of the hallmarks. The hope of making it too expensive before the winter didn't work out. The European Commission came up with macroeconomic stability support, etc. So that I would say. Regarding the political leadership and the relationship between the military leadership, it's very interesting, this whole debacle between Yevgeny Prigozhin and Ramzan Kadyrov on the one hand, saying that the defense ministry in Russia and the general staff are idiots and incompetent, and getting a lot of backing from the Russian military bloggers community and assorted military influencers. That, I would say, is the kind of that's the whole debate that is allowed to happen in Russia. Either you're for the war or you want much more war, and then the defense ministry is bad. I think that in a way, I think it's functioning for the Russian political leadership, because they need to channel those voices, the disappointment of why did this not go better? Well, then we can have people allowed to express some dissatisfaction with the defense ministry and the general staff. However, they've been kept on up until now, and they have possessed the primary virtue in the Russian political system of being loyal. This could be Gerasimov's last chance. British Defense Intelligence reports that they're very unhappy with the results from the winter and spring offensive from the Russian end, which they should be. But it hasn't been any more kind of large scale disagreements than that. And I think it all boils down to the fact that this is not, if you would have asked the Russian general staff, take 9 months and prepare for an invasion of Ukraine, you would have seen something very different than what happened in February 2022. I think that the whole problem is that this was designed based on assumption of a strategy of non-military warfare being very effective, and then hand it down to general staff and being, okay, it didn't work, you guys take over, do the best what you can.
I'm curious if we can take a step back. I do want to, we're getting some questions coming in, but I want to take a step back and address the political will aspect and the non-military means, and how you're seeing that play out against the West. Certainly within the United States, you're hearing increasing questions and calls, which are organic, about the long-term support for Ukraine. But we've seen, the Russian propagandists, the broader ecosystem that draws upon them, questioning the American and Western support and political resolve and will. How do you see that playing out? Certainly, if you're looking to a January 2025 timeframe, certainly that's the case. The war is not going to be ending anytime soon, and that question of resolve and will becomes significantly more magnified going forward.
Yeah, no, I think it is a legit debate to have, and I think there's legit voices doubting to which the idea this is a good strategy. And I know you didn't ask me the question, but I say, for the total amount of, around 5% of U.S. military budget of reducing the whole Russian armed forces to, or at least half of it, to rubbles, I think that's a very cost-effective investment. But you didn't ask me about that. No, I think that Russian approach to the West has mostly been based on non-military means. And that includes the whole spectrum of, intelligence and influence operations, to cyber attacks, to information operations, to economic means. I think the really good news that has happened since the Russian invasion in 2012 is that a lot of Russian opportunity to influence the West through its non-military means have vanished. One of my favorite examples is the following. One of Putin's closest oligarchs from his Petersburg time, Gennady Timchenko, sold significant stake in his energy company Novatech to French Total, the French energy giant. He got the Légion d'honneur. And then in 2014, when Russia invaded Ukraine the last time around, Timchenko did not get sanctioned by the EU. They got sanctioned by the US Treasury, but there was no agreement in the EU that they could sanction Timchenko. Total came out and said, we don't want any sanctions on Russia. I mean, you're talking about probably one of the absolute most important companies in France getting state captured by buying a stake in a Russian energy company, and coming out and going against its own host state security policy and saying, let's not sanction Russia. I think those kind of opportunities by bribing influence in the West through offering lucrative energy deals, I think it's out of the windows. British Petroleum bought a stake of Rosneft, and when Khodorkovsky was thrown in jail in 2003, he was the richest man in Russia, and he had the biggest oil companies. And the criticism in the West was very loud until they put up Yukov's constituent part into sale and allowed Western energy giants to buy in. After that, our criticism was much more cautious. So that's just one example where I think Russian opportunities to influence Western policies by offering economic integration, I think it's gone. Not completely gone, but it will be so much harder now to say, a new Russia's coming. If we only trade with them, everything will be fine. I think in terms of the other ones, when it comes to information operations, when it comes to cyber attacks, when it comes to intelligence operations in general, all of them are I would describe them as omnipresent, but not very seldom in itself gives a strategic effect. Like, it's not that, you have a troll farm running things saying that, immigrants raped this just German woman, which was, for instance, the case. And then all of a sudden, Germany turns around and becomes pro-Russian. But all of them works as kind of the long-term gradual erosion of Western cohesion, which is the biggest strategic problem for the Russia. And they can impact things in the margins, but they're seldom in themselves. You wave a wand and then you have policy change. So I think that all of them are manageable, and especially in 2023, we have a very different perception of this than when I started writing the book in 2012. So I do think I'm not that worried, even though we need to see them as omnipresent and understand the goals and take the steps to mitigate them.
Two follow-on questions from that. So I'm going to take one from the audience in a moment, but I want to follow up really quickly on that. You rightly note that the non-military means that Russia had to influence or affect Western policy and policymakers are dramatically curtailed. At least right now, we see the investments opportunities drying up. Oligarchs are being sanctioned and kicked out. And we saw Chelsea Football Club had to divest themselves of Abramovich. The intelligence collection activities have been sharply curtailed, with numbers of spy rings being rolled up. And so the totality of Russian information operations seems to be sharply curtailed for right now. Do you see that as suggesting that Russia may turn to other alternative, not information means? Do you see a potential for increased aggression or greater activities and more aggressive intelligence and security operations afield? What do you see as sort of that next step if those mechanisms are sharply curtailed?
No, I think that you're very right in your question, the whole premise of it. I mean, Russia's two most important means, their armed forces and their energy influence, are for the foreseeable future drastically reduced. However, I don't think that means that the Russian regime is going to say, okay, well, we'll just kick back at home. That will need to be compensated. And I mean, one of the obvious one is nuclear signaling, and the other ones are increased use of non-military means. And I mean, the problem with, if you look through those, you can take Sweden and Finland, for instance, after joining NATO. Before joining NATO, Russian foreign minister said it's going to have the most significant consequences, and we're going to make the Baltic Sea a nuclear zone, etc., etc. And then when it happened, Vladimir Putin came out and said, we don't really see this as a problem. We kind of knew that Finland and Sweden was there all along, but if you build up military infrastructure, there will be consequences. But at the same time, you saw a number of cyber attacks towards Sweden, towards Finland. You had some towards Finnish parliament, Finnish governmental offices, but that underlines kind of the lack of strategic effect for most cyber operations. If the parliament's webpage is down, that kind of sucks if you're a researcher and you need a document, but it's not a strategic impact on the state of Finland that will make them rethink, oh wow, this is really scary with NATO, let's do something else. So I think that cyber warfare is contrary to popular opinion, one of the slowest forms of warfare, because if you're going to have significant attacks, like Ukraine have witnessed, to the banking sector, to the energy grid, etc., you need to spend a long time scouting all these systems, how they work, then you need access, and when you have access, you need to pull the trigger, and then you get an effect. So my take is, for instance, cyber attacks can be incredibly useful, but it takes so much time, and it's hard. For instance, on the case of Sweden and Finland, we need to impact Sweden and Finland. Let's push the button now, and then everything goes out. It doesn't really work that way, and I think that's the case. I think, I do expect much more intense use of non-military means, and even since, the last invasion of Ukraine in 2014, you saw that the gloves are off, and that the Russian intelligence and security services really don't care that much about whether they are busted or what kind of consequences. Chemical weapons on British soil is not something you do if you're worried about the relation with the UK. So I do think that the last years we've already seen an even higher acceptance of risk in information intelligence operations, and I only expect that to increase. But I also, especially in terms of information operations, the soil is not that fertile anymore in the way it was before.
So we need to start watching out for more tourists looking at Salisbury Cathedral going forward.
The beautiful spires.
We got a couple questions coming in. I'm going to take them sort of in turn. One is, how do you see the Russian internal security thinking looking and transitioning towards the emergence of China and the relationship with China? How do you see that sort of understanding of war and peace looking towards the future relationship with Beijing?
Yeah, I think so. The fun part about Russian thinking of China is it's always been that country that cannot be named. So it's always been, the West is super aggressive, they're the big problems, etc. But it's also been this kind of, in the hallways, Russian pundits and so will be like, yeah, but we're actually worried about China. So very little of that has been actually explicit, and I think I haven't seen that much of it still today. But my sense is that there's actually quite a lot of unease in Russian highest circles about Chinese influence. I think in particular because they know where they have the West. The West, for instance, will always come to the negotiating table. If Russia creates a crisis, they know they can always get out of it because Western leaders will always come to the negotiating table, which also creates all the incentives for you to create crises when you want something. On the Chinese part, the Russian leadership don't have that same predictability, and they know they're also incredibly clever and incredibly long-term. So if you look at the latest summit when Xi came, Putin got rhetorical support and nothing else. Xi got basically everything he wanted: food stuff, energy, cooperation on digital surveillance, and I do think that Russian thinking in Russia and China is I think they're very worrisome, but I also think that's the only place they can turn to. And the biggest X factor in this war is if Russia manages to get significant military support from China, particularly artillery ammunition. I'm not speculating how likely that is, but no, I do think there's a big unease about China in Russia.
There's another question that comes from the audience that I'm going to parse and sort of change a little bit. When we look to kind of what an outcome in Ukraine looks like, it seems that right now we're potentially approaching a frozen conflict with neither really getting the sense of a significant operational gains. Where do you see this conflict heading? If the Ukrainian offensive is successful, are we talking about retaking Crimea? If the Russians manage to stop that, are we going to end up in a Minsk III situation or some sort of resolution? And if, as has been argued, that Russia manages to secure some territorial gains, do you see a future whereby there will be increased predation, not just on Ukraine, but potentially in the Baltic states, which is an argument that has been made before in opposition to any territorial acquiescence to Moscow?
Great. How will the war end? we
No
got a
pressure.
bit of time. No, first of all, I don't see the frozen conflict as of yet. I for a number of reasons. I think that even though you haven't seen large change of territory the last months, there's a lot of changes to the conflict, which is not, you know, tangible, and that has to do with the Russian side putting in their mobilized personnel and trying to go on 4 to 5 offensives without yielding much more than their own attrition. Even attrition on Ukraine as well, but Ukraine has also kept their 3 army corps, which they're building separate from the fighting on the front. And they are getting not enough, but a large number of Western material, tanks and infantry fighting vehicles. So when you see T-54s on the Russian railways, which, you know, whose prototype were designed in 1945, you see Ukraine fielding some of the most modern Western tanks. So the trajectory is actually looking like this. You know, Russian T-90s, T-72s, T-80s, T-72s, and maybe T-54s. You see Ukraine's tank fleet getting more and more modern. However, quantity is a huge issue. But I do think that this spring offensive could produce an incredible turning point in the war. So the optimist in me says, just like the Ukrainian Chief of General Staff, we beat the Russian professional army, now we're going to beat the Russian mobilized army. And if they do, if Ukraine has a successful spring offensive, what more has the Russian side to hope for on the battlefield? You know, if the professional forces are beaten, and if their big push for mobilization and their forces are beating, you know, will another round of mobilization solve things? However, the pessimist in me is that since October, in particular, the Russian side has been digging trenches, putting up tank obstacles, layered with mines for waves and waves and waves. And this is no easy task. I mean, Ukrainian counteroffensives in Kharkiv and Kherson were great, but they were also functioning in a context of, on the one hand, large attrition and channeling terrain, and the other one on lack of manpower. So on the other side, if Ukraine's spring offensive doesn't yield anything, then I think we'll start getting into the discussion of some sort of de facto ceasefire. But if you look at the political aspect of the war, first you look at the Ukrainian side. You have, you know, 75+% supports fighting until the end, until all Ukrainian territory is reclaimed, including Crimea. And then you have a political leadership that is virtually unable to compromise in any way, because every Ukrainian have seen what happened in the occupied territories. We're talking about deportation, we're talking about torture, we're talking about assassinations, deportations of kids. How are you going to say to your own people, oh, you know, they'll have 15% more? We know exactly what kind of cleansing that is going on in this, but it's better for the country. The problem, on the other hand, is that you're also facing from the Russian leadership dynamic. When the war ends and Putin looks around to his elite and to his people and said, that was that. You know, how did we do? Like 200,000 KIA, WIA, to get a little piece of completely bombed part of southeastern Ukraine with an economy in shambles and political isolation. It will never, that after action review will never come out with a conclusive answer saying this was a wonderful idea, let's do it again. So I think from the Russian political leadership perspective, there's also big incentive to continue the war unless it's going horribly, horribly bad. So I think that the political incentives, for what I can overlook at this moment, suggest continued fighting. If the fundamentals shift, I'm happy to say I have a new assessment, but for now I do see continued fighting, and I don't see them frozen at all. I do see both sides are looking into that. And last part towards the Baltic states or not? No, I don't see that at all. And I'll also get the question if Russia's going to invade Moldova or not. I think if anything, Russia's throwing everything they have into Ukraine and are struggling to secure any big wins. And if anything, they've emptied their regiments on the Finnish and Baltic border. And I think it will take not decade, but 5 years plus to reconstitute what they had before this war. So starting another front, I think, will be the surest way to ensure defeat. And Russia has so far invaded 2 countries that it perceived to be on a NATO membership path, and 0 countries that are members of NATO. So I think the Baltic states are safe.
Another question that comes from the audience is, do you have any thoughts on the increasing acceptance by Russia in the intersection with the space domain as sort of a military but non-military means of communication?
Increasing acceptance?
Yes.
Okay.
Or how do you see space sort of playing out in this domain?
Okay. Yeah. No, I think I do think that the Russian aerospace forces have always kind of viewed it as a more integrated manner than its Western equivalents. And I do think, if anything, the Russian side has always been a lot more pragmatic to whatever terms of what works. I think one of the big conclusions in the book is that the Russian understanding of war comes from a non-sentimental impact assessment. So if we are being impacted in the information domain, let's think of how we cut ourselves away from the internet. If we are being impacted in, the US relying on a GPS advantage, how do we blow up the whole GPS system? So I think that in that way, I think it's more of a Western thing to think of, hey, there's this domain in space where we do not fight. Whereas the Russian side will be, okay, do they have an advantage for something in space? Okay, let's blow it up. Or let's block it, or let's jam it. So I do think it's very non-sentimental in terms of what yields the US an advantage. That has to do with the international financial system as well. Okay, let's sell all our dollars, which Russia did a couple of years ago, and just stockpile the second largest pile of gold in the world, for instance, to protect themselves to the dollar dominance.
I'm going to ask one more question, because we are approaching at the end of the hour here, and I might go over a few moments if I borrow some more of your time. I'm curious at an intellectual framework, as you've rightly outlined in this fantastic book, how this has evolved, what has happened since 2012 and 2014, all the way to the expanded invasion in 2022. How do you see the outcome of this war, be it a potentially sellable at home victory for whatever that looks like within Russia, or a decided conventional defeat on the battlefield, or indeed both? How do you see the intellectual framework of their understanding of war and peace changing now that you see such a heavy conventional battlefield, but also the continued importance, as you rightly note, of the information domain? Do you see it changing, or is it going to be more of the same going forward?
That's a great question. I really like the question. No, I think it all depends on what kind of why the defeat will come. And I've been interviewing people that has been studied Russian General Staff Academy, and just to understand culture, and the culture is just one of the most fundamental stuff in what makes these kind of things. And one of the things, what they do is they look closely at the Second World War, and then they calculate an industrial capacity. And in the Russian General Staff, you conclude that Germany peaked in 1942. German industrial production peaked in 1942. That's why they lost. We moved east of the Urals, and we outproduced the Germans, and therefore we won. So I think that one part of kind of what will become, and I mean, this is reflected in the mid-2000s, when you had the former Deputy Chief of General Staff and President of the Russian Academy of Military Sciences, Mahmoud Garayev. He was president for over 2 decades. And the big protege, Vladimir Slipchenko, who was pioneering non-contact warfare, and all of fighting would be distance with long precision missiles, said Slipchenko, and Garayev said, no, war is kind of eternal. It's about industrial production. It's about mass. It's about kind of perseverance of will. Puliadura shtik maladiets. The bullet is a fool, but the bayonet is a good friend. And it's really the same discussion, because you could say Garayev was right. He saw the industrial production as kind of just staying in the fight and avoiding collapse is the way to win. So I think that will be one of the lessons. And I mean, Russian doctrines, they've been preparing for decades about just economic self-dependence and wartime economy, transitioning to wartime economy, which they're doing right now. That I think will be one thing, and because I think that the way in which the story of this war will be written in Russia is we stood against the entire NATO industrial production. And the thing is, the jury is still out who will be able to produce most, artillery rounds the coming 12 months. So that could also be, hey, this is what won us the war or won us a frozen peace, is that we outproduced entire NATO. I think that will be one of them. I'll have to think some more on it because it's such a good question. But I think that the industrial aspect will be one of them.
Well, this has been an absolutely fantastic conversation. We can easily go well into the next hour and probably beyond. And I will like to extend an open invitation for when you do find yourself in Washington, D.C., that we can continue this conversation. But short of that, I'd certainly love to revisit this in a month or two to kind of continue building out this dialogue. I want to welcome Representative Nye, our president and CEO, to sort of round out the discussion and close our conversation. But thank you so much for this opportunity. It is great to meet and have this discussion about a very timely and important topic.
I'd just like to echo Joshua's thanks, Dr. Jonsson, for your sharing tremendous insights with us today. You mentioned several times that your analysis is appropriate for the moment, but could change as the situation on the ground changes. So it seems to me pretty clear that we may have more opportunities to get your updates and your thoughts as we go forward. It was tremendously helpful for our thinking, and I hope for the thinking of the audience. Thanks to Joshua Huminski for moderating a wonderful and important conversation. We look forward to having you all back for more conversations in this series, and to all those who were able to join us online in the audience. Thank you for your questions and for your participation. We look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.